Hi, everyone. So there's already been kind of a lot of great.
We have questions, or
I think at the end.
okay.
A lot of great helpful framing around environmental justice and the inequities in the city that Rachel and others have provided. I'm just going to focus more specifically on our energy sector and environmental justice in that context. As Rachel mentioned, that's a lot of what I focus on at NYLB. I do climate and energy work fairly broadly, but I wanted to focus in on one specific piece of my work that is providing legal support to community groups building out renewable energy projects. So when we think about energy and environmental justice, there's a couple of issues that generally come up. Sort of the first one that tends to come to mind is, as Rachel mentioned, around the siting of polluting infrastructure. So for context and putting that in the framing of the sort of racial and socioeconomic injustices, 7 out of 10 people of color live within 30 miles of a polluting power plant. So this is not generally something that uniformly impacts everyone. And the air pollution that results from a lot of these fossil fuel power generation facilities can result in early death and a whole host of chronic health issues, respiratory problems, chronic asthma, heart disease, neurological issues, and this is especially exacerbated for young people and the elderly and people with underlying health issues. So this is really something that impacts people's lives in a very real way and creates a lot of health issues as well. And in turn, it's sort of a twofold issue because low-income communities and communities of color also experience disproportionate impacts of climate change. So the results of that fossil fuel generation not only fall on them in real time, it also results in extreme weather events exacerbated by climate change that these communities are really on the front lines of. So the picture on the lower bottom, the bottom one is Alphabet City right after Superstorm Sandy, so on the Lower East Side. 55% of those impacted by storm surge from Superstorm Sandy were very low-income renters earning on average $18,000 per year. So you can imagine the sort of resources that folks had to address that kind of flooding were fairly limited. They were, these were low-income communities that did not have a lot of resources to fall back on. And as one of Rachel's maps illustrated, when we think about extreme heat, it's often low-income communities of color. So Harlem, Central Brooklyn, the Southern Bronx, these are all areas where they're going to be seeing more extreme heat as climate change worsens. So it's sort of this double impact. And then within the energy sector, there's also this issue of energy affordability and energy burden. So for low-income individuals, they spend a much larger percentage of their income on energy costs. So low-income households spend upwards of 25% of their income towards energy costs, whereas the sort of average for higher income households is 3%. So that's a huge difference. And when you're talking about a paycheck that really needs to be stretched pretty far, 25% of that going towards electricity and gas is pretty substantial. And these communities and these utility customers are paying into the system at such high levels, but really not seeing a lot of benefits from the energy sector. So, for example, a report that was put out by the NAACP showed that for 1 year, African Americans were estimated to spend $41 billion on energy. So that's what they're putting into this economic sector. But in contrast, that same year, they only held 1.1% of jobs in the energy sector and only received 0.01% of revenues coming out of the energy sector. So it's a total mismatch in terms of what's being put in and where the benefits are flowing out. And even, we're seeing in the kind of clean energy sector, a lot of these imbalances and inequities are sort of being repeated. So we're seeing a lot of issues with low-income people being able to access clean energy, get solar energy on their homes or access to it in some form, and get access to jobs in the clean energy sector. So even though you think of clean energy as the solution, if it's not done in an equitable way, it's going to repeat the same sort of dynamics that we've been seeing with the traditional energy sector. So the good news is we know the solutions. They've largely surfaced through the very hard work of organizers and community groups and people on the front lines of these issues, where this is really a life and death in a lot of cases. So a lot of the groups that we work with are putting forth really innovative, visionary solutions to this problem. We often think in the environmental justice context of, if there's polluting infrastructure, we'll file a lawsuit. We will, push agencies to regulate these facilities better, and sort of strategies in that vein, which are, incredibly effective and have really, underpinned a lot of EJ work in the energy sector. Now we're also kind of in tandem with that, looking at some more affirmative solutions. So what can we build that can help these communities sort of move towards a more positive future, and systems that actually provide them benefits rather than just fighting the systems that are not working for them. So my work helping groups develop renewable energy is really in that vein. And it's both about, bringing clean energy online that can then displace the need for dirtier sources of energy that will likely be cited in those communities. But it's also about these communities and households getting access to what we kind of refer to as co-benefits of, clean energy that have been available to higher income people for a long time. So those sorts of co-benefits are job creation and workforce development in the clean energy sector, reduced energy bills, more reliability around your energy sources, lower energy costs, system resiliency. There's a whole host of additional benefits that you get access to when you have access to clean energy. So it's about equity on that level as well. And one of the sort of key mechanisms that helps us realize that that sort of access to clean energy for people who have not traditionally had access is community solar. So this might be something you've been hearing about. The sort of regulations that allow for community solar came down a few years ago at this point. And this is essentially, the way a community solar project works is, if you're not able to put solar on your own roof or have access to solar on your own building, you can essentially participate in an off-site, larger scale solar system. So if you think of like a big facility in your neighborhood, maybe it's a Costco or a Whole Foods or a library or a big parking lot, a big solar system can get built on that site, and then neighbors in the community can participate, and then they would receive credits on their bills, and they would be, buying into this or participating in this clean energy, infrastructure in their community. So it's a really exciting mechanism that I think a lot of groups and people in general saw as a great opportunity to equalize access to clean energy. It addresses barriers that have traditionally been the reasons that folks haven't been able to access solar energy in the past. So things like upfront capital costs, these are, not cheap pieces of technology, and so they, there is a certain kind of cost associated with them, and if you can't access capital or access credit to finance them, which is often an issue for low-income people as well, you're probably not going to be able to get a solar system on your home. More often than not, especially in New York City, you might be a renter, so you don't have control of your roof. You don't get to decide what gets put on your roof, and so that's a huge issue as well. And then kind of in the sort of very logistical and sort of the physical limitation vein, maybe your roof is shaded. Again, in a dense urban core, there are buildings nearby that are taller. Maybe your roof is not structurally sound. This is a big issue. Roofs need to be kind of good to go for the 20 to 30 year time horizon for a project. So if your roof isn't in good shape, then that's another additional cost to get it up and running. So these are all reasons why the traditional rooftop solar approach has not really worked for everyone. And so community solar really opens up that opportunity. So kind of digging into the specifics of the work in this space, two client groups that we've worked with on a number of things. We work with them on our waste equity work and a range of other issues. So Uprose in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, and the Point CDC in Hunts Point in the Bronx really saw community solar as a way to realize some of the larger campaigns and goals that they had around equity and climate justice and energy justice. And so they really wanted to basically build out a model for how community groups, especially in EJ communities, could provide this sort of affirmative vision for a clean energy economy and address so many of the underlying issues that they'd been battling on other fronts up until now. So they essentially approached us and said, we want to get involved in this. This sounds exciting, this new law that's now in the books that allows us to do these types of projects. This was really exciting, I think, for NYCHA for a couple of reasons. One, we follow a community lawyering model, so we both have familiarity with and a commitment to working with community groups. So to do this in tandem with a community group is very much within our mission. And community solar projects also really require a very strong local sponsor and a community group that is really, embedded in their place and can kind of do the education and the capacity building and the organizing among their own community members to bring something like this online and then get people to participate and understand what the opportunity is and what they might get involved with. So. You can also imagine these are, substantial development projects. When we think about any other kind of community development project, any other construction project for that matter, there's a lot of pieces that go into it. And so those of you who maybe are even involved in project finance work, the many stages, the many sort of pieces of legal work, financing, all of these things are fairly big undertakings for small grassroots community organizations. So it really takes a partnership and a team approach, and so NYCHA came on to provide the legal piece of that work, and we do that pro bono. We're a nonprofit, but we also are able to connect projects to really great expertise through our pro bono clearinghouse. So we're able to bring on, great transactional lawyers from all the firms around New York City to help out with this as well, which is huge. I mean, the legal bills for this type of project can be, enormous if it's not done pro bono. So it's both great for the community group and it's great for a lot of transactional lawyers who don't get to do a lot of pro bono work. Often it's in the litigation space that we see a lot of pro bono work. So it's been really fun to build out those partnerships as well. So when we think about kind of the legal work on the transactional side of EJ work and on these projects, there's a lot to kind of work with, and sort of beyond what we think of typically in terms of legal work for development projects, which we can sort of brainstorm what that means: leases, contracts, permitting, entity formation, land use issues, financing. All of that is part of what we help out with. But we also have this additional piece where the group's main interest in doing these projects is to have benefits flow to their communities. And so how do you translate that objective into a legal structure and a business model that allows you to do that? So that's been a really interesting process to translate what the community groups are articulating from their member base, that we want the revenues from our project to go into a community fund that can then finance great programming. Maybe it finances an urban farm or a community garden, or we get a better library, or whatever it is, or maybe there was a strong sense from the member base that those who are most utility burdened, have the highest energy bills, get the biggest offsets on their bills by participating in this project. So there were a lot of different benefits and interests that groups were articulating that they wanted, and so part of our work is to translate that into the legal framework that they can use for their projects. So that has taken a couple different forms and is very much of an iterative process, but sometimes it looks like forming something that's more like a cooperative. Sometimes it's forming an LLC where the community-based organization is a member. So thinking through ownership and governance structures for this type of project is kind of especially tricky because of the sort of added piece of really wanting community benefit to be baked into all of these sort of foundational documents and structures. And then the other sort of tricky piece with these types of projects is the financing. So these sorts of innovative and novel ownership and governance structures, as you can imagine, are not, a lot of traditional financiers are not familiar with them and are a little nervous about financing something that they haven't really seen before. And when we're talking about nonprofit sponsors of these projects, when we're talking about having subscribers that don't make a lot of income, then what does a financing strategy look like, and how can we find some middle ground to address the concerns of those who might finance the project? They obviously have to meet their bottom line and get some basic return to invest in the project, but maintain this idea that most of the benefits are not funneling out of the community, that they're still staying inside. So it's very much of a balance, and some of it is around educating, folks in the finance world around, these sorts of projects not being as scary as they may seem. That's the good thing. The sun always shines, so there's sort of an underlying reliability about solar projects. So we always try to fall back on that. So just some sort of quick takeaways. We're very much still in the weeds on these projects. None of them are online. It's a long process. I think it takes longer than we thought it would. Or maybe I was just overly optimistic in what I was hoping it would take. But a big part of that is really wanting to get it right. And so building out the sort of foundation is really important. I think starting early and talking with groups about what they really want out of this, and sort of pushing for an articulation of, I think we talk about community benefit and we talk about community ownership, but really drilling down into what does that mean? What does that look like? Who do you want making decisions? So we kind of have a checklist at this point of questions to ask that really get more into the details on what that means. The other piece is, these are projects that obviously wanted to not have a lot of money flowing out, and really wanted to have a lot of the revenue from the project staying in, which meant, we didn't want to be spending a ton of money on our lease payments for roof space or for the land that we would put these projects on. So we were often turning to public sector entities to sort of tap into either state-owned or city-owned properties to think about how to do these projects, which is great because you definitely have more leverage on the sort of community benefits angle. If you go to a public sector entity and say, hey, you're not using this roof on this big facility you have, if you let us use it through a lease, you'll be supporting a great project that has a ton of community benefit, and you'll be getting, some lease payments. They might not be market rate lease payments, but you'll be getting something. It's much easier to make that argument than when you're going to a private sector entity and sort of asking them to, out of the goodness of their heart, give you a break on the lease payments. So kind of all of the bureaucracy and sort of distributed decision making that you get with a public sector entity is what we've been running into, and so it's just a longer process. And negotiating a lease, as you can imagine, with a state government agency is quite a challenge. So you do run into that, and I think these are things that are in some ways not unique to these kinds of projects, but they're definitely magnified when we're talking about projects that really are intended to benefit the community. And then the last thing I'll say is a sort of really interesting iterative process kind of emerged from this, where we were doing both policy and regulatory advocacy around energy policy in New York. And we were on the ground trying to build out these projects sort of being the embodiment of what that looks like, and then this policy being this high-level articulation. So we were able to kind of inform our policy advocacy by our work on the ground, and vice versa. So understanding what was going on in the policy space allowed us to help projects utilize that policy more effectively. So that has emerged as a really nice kind of feedback loop that has, I think, made both our policy work and our project work more effective. And I think is probably one of the best ways for policy to be informed, is if it's people who are trying to get this stuff done on the ground as well. So I will leave it at that. Hopefully that's a helpful overview.
Thank you.